Hey everybody, this lecture today is going to be discussing addiction and free will, uh, and talking about sort of ethics from the perspective of whether or not we've got something like moral responsibility and how we ought to think about the ethics of addiction. Jumping right in. So addiction, sort of following up on kind of the topic that we talked about, and like thinking about the opioid crisis. When talking about addiction, we can see generally that addiction is bad. Right? It's bad for the addict, the person that is addicted, to whatever it is that they're addicted to. It's usually bad for those around the addict, bad for society, etc. This is generally because the addict, is unable to live a sort of flourishing life. The oftentimes the thing that the addict is addicted to, while it seems that it gives the addict a kind of relief, it tends the fact that the addict is addicted to the substance usually causes more stress uh, than it's than the relief kind of gives. This often takes away from the addict being able to interact with those around the individual in the right kinds of ways, right? Because they are often seeking a certain sort of substance or acting in certain ways to be able to use. And then it's also detrimental for society because this person usually doesn't have the wherewithal to be able to actually act in certain ways, right, that are generally pro-social. They will act in oftentimes more selfish ways, or be unable to work, or be unable to just sort of interact normally. Um, the addicted life, def- sort of from a Aristotelian point of view, is one that lacks some of the necessary features for a flourishing life, right? Someone that is addicted has has a certain sort of vice, and hasn't found the golden mean between vices in certain aspects of life. Um, so then the sort of initial ethical question comes to: is it wrong to act in ways that can lead one to addiction? And you'll get sort of differing answers depending on which ethical theory you subscribe to. On the one hand, it's clearly seems like yes, addiction is taking actions that lead one to become addicted is wrong because it's ultimately going to cause more misery than happiness. So, on a sort of utilitarian way of thinking, you ought not to be acting in such a way where the consequences of your actions will bring about less happiness than could have been otherwise. And so becoming an addict seems to be one of those kinds of things. And on the other hand, from a more deontological point of view, acting in ways that lead to addiction uh, seem to involve treating yourself and others as mere means, or as not as valuable as ultimately you are, right? And they are. So you shouldn't act in this way because ultimately you're using yourself in a sense to just to get high, or to get some sort of relief from the substance, and then that substance ultimately, you become addicted to it. I mean, nobody, it's very rare that anyone is ever trying to become an addict, but acting in ways that can ultimately lead to to being addicted, especially under foreseen circumstances where you foresee that you will become an addict. These things seem problematic because you're not treating yourself um, well. So clearly, I think it seems like you shouldn't act in ways that lead to addiction, but clearly also some people do, right? So when they do, how should we think of them? How should we treat them? How should we treat them with more moral reproach? Should we judge them? Should we blame them? So now, of course, there is this sort of general stigma that exists about or towards addicts and as individuals, right? I mean, in our society, we see people that are addicted to substances and they can't control themselves, and they, like, bad things tend to happen around them. They neglect individuals, other individuals. They neglect their jobs. They have to live in very poor situations, and people sort of tend to think a set of things about them in relation to all these things, right? So people tend to think that addicts are immoral in some way, that they did it to themselves, that they're only the only person that they have to blame is themselves for this, that they are in a way a drain on society, that they need to pick themselves up out of off their from their own bootstraps, and that they don't deserve any kind of treatment or hand holding that will continually put strain or drain on the system that of society. Um, and then in relation to this, that we shouldn't treat drug addicts using other drugs, right? Like using methadone for people that are addicted to heroin, because that sort of defeats the purpose, is the idea there, right? That, well, you're just substituting one drug addiction for another. Um, are all of these attitudes justified? Like, is it really true? Are any of these attitudes true? And should we take them seriously, or should we reject them outright? Are there good reasons to reject these outright when it comes to thinking about the ethics of addiction and the ethical treatment of people that are addicts? Well, ultimately, this is going to depend, I think, on what addiction is, right? So we should think of addiction as a kind of state that a person is in, the state when they're an addict. But it really depends on whether or not being an addict is akin to being a bad person in some other way, or whether acting in ways that addicts act is akin to acting in ways that other people act when they're doing bad things, right? So, murderers, rapists, pedophiles, abusers, thieves, people that we generally think of as, acting in ways that are morally problematic and bad for society. Um, should we think of addicts among these, or are they seriously different in certain ways, right? So all of these individuals act in ways that are detrimental to society, but do addicts really fall in with this crowd? I think intuitively, no. On first pass, the sort of gut reaction may be yes, to lump all social ills, all bad, all people that have problems, that make society more difficult, together. But intuitively, I don't think addicts count among the individuals that do certain kinds of awful things. But why not? Because certainly addicts do terrible things. Like oftentimes, on the basis of becoming an addict, they will become a thief, right? Because they have to support their habit, or while in the throes of being on a certain kind of drug or something, they may have violent outbursts. So what should we think about, like the difference? What's the difference here? Well, I think it depends ultimately on what addiction is, and so how we need to think about it. If we have some kind of grasp on what addiction really is as a state, we can start to think more well about how we should treat addicts, and how we should sort of think about them among the sort of hierarchy of ethics, right? Where certainly they aren't living a flourishing life, they aren't living a good life, but they are living a life that's maybe better in some ways than someone that's a murderer or a rapist. And so how should we think about these things in relation to one another? Um, so there's first, like, to sort of get a picture of how addiction might work, we should think about theories of motivation. So, what is it that makes somebody an addict? Well, it's a kind of substance that they are taking, and the substance that they're taking seems to have taken some kind of control, or the person has lost some kind of control over their ability to, you know, put down the substance, right? And ultimately what that means is something like, well, the person has lost their ability to have control over their own motivational structure when it comes to acting in certain ways. Well, in order to understand that, we need to understand how motivation works. And there are different theories on how motivation works. One of the sort of most ancient theories, I'll call it here the naive theory of motivation, sort of has some very preliminary building blocks. So almost all theories of motivation start off with these basics. We are human. Human beings are motivated partly, at least, by our desires. Like we have desires for things. We want certain things. We need certain things. We have emotional feelings for desire, and we have sort of like higher level desires where we think about what we want. And then we order these desires based on our preferences. So we have like beliefs about what desires are more important and what desires are less important. And then our motivational structure hopefully kind of um, delineates from that, right? So right now, I have a desire to eat a sandwich, but I know that, finishing this lecture is more important. So my desire to finish this lecture before I go eat a sandwich, I've ranked those. Now, given those preferences, we also have certain beliefs and experiences of the world. So, like, right now I have the belief that there's stuff to make sandwiches in the refrigerator. And so, I know how to act on that, uh, on my desire because I have the right set of beliefs. So, if we take the beliefs that I have about the world and how the world really is, and based on my experiences, and combine them with the desires that I have, we can come up with, and this is the thought, is that how this works in human sort of cognition. We create intentions, right? So on the basis of having certain amount of knowledge, a certain sort of set of beliefs, and a certain set of desires, we can create intentions to act in certain ways. Um, Now, okay, so now I know, so I take my belief that there's certain things in the fridge, my desire to make a sandwich, I create then the intention to make a sandwich. That intention hopefully motivates me to act in such a way as to make a sandwich. Great, that tells us how motivation might work, or at least basically. But how, in this view, ultimately, are you going to act sort of rightly or wrongly? How does sort of the intention here gonna, like, how is it gonna matter for morality and when it comes to motivation? Well, you get a couple of different pictures, right? So on one basic picture, you might have this belief that a certain action is a good action, right? Like morally good. Um, Understanding that it's morally good, if you also have the desire that you want that like to do what's morally good, then taking that action uh, should be easy based on your desire, right? You believe that a certain action is morally good. You intend to do what is morally good. Well, then you're going to form the intention to do the thing because it's morally good. Here, in a sense, we have like a kind of normal case of acting on the belief that a certain action is good or the right one to take. And then on the other side of sort of there's going to be ultimately like multiple kinds of immoral ways of acting, right? You could act in the same way as above. The first one, you think that some action is morally wrong, and you could want to do what is morally wrong, and then taking an intention to do what is morally wrong. Now that's usually not how this works, right? Most people don't act on purpose to do what is morally wrong. However, what more often happens is that you realize that you can do a certain action while kind of maybe knowing that that action is wrong or bad. However, your desire is such that you want to bring about that action while not caring like about whether or not the action is good or bad, right? So it's not that you want to bring about the bad thing, right? The morally bad thing. It's that you want to bring about the sort of event that will occur on the basis of the action, even while recognizing that the action may be bad. And so then ultimately you take the action, and bring about the bad. You take the bad action to bring about the event that you want to bring about, even sort of recognizing that it's wrong. So here, ultimately, we'll have a case based on sort of desire, even while believing that an action is wrong. So we can act badly in this case based on our desires to act in ways that ultimately are bad, even if we don't have desires to act badly, right? Now, on this theory, we always act on our considered desires. That means we always have these desires. They're very, like, they are aware to us. We're aware of our desires. And based on those desires, we decide how we're going to act given certain beliefs that we have. And ultimately, we're going to do, when we do bad things, when we do things that are wrong, it's because we want to do them. Now, it's not necessarily true that we always know that they're wrong, but ultimately, when we know that they are bad, we take them anyways, because there's something that we want there, and we don't care so much about not doing what's bad in that case, right? Um, when we see, on this view of motivation, then when we see someone act in certain ways and we see that they act in ways that are wrong or bad, we think, oh, okay, they wanted to do this wrong or bad thing more than they wanted to do good, right? And this ultimately helps explain why they acted in the way that they did, why their action is wrong, why we might think of them as a bad person, and why we can then sanction that individual on this basic view, right? The idea is like, well, look, this person has the wrong set of desires. They desired to do this thing that was bad more than this other thing that was good, or just more than just doing what was good. And so they clearly want to do bad things. And so we should put a stop to them by, putting them in jail, taking away their means to act in certain ways, or whatever. Okay, so that's one theory of moral motivation. We might call this the considered desire theory. The naive theory is ultimately just that all motivation ultimately just comes from the desires that you have and you're aware of. But do we really actually always act on our considered desires? This theory sort of seems to have some problems with it. Um, it's the sort of one of the major problems is that it seems on this view that it's not possible to want to do what's right or good, to have the right kind of desires, but to actually fail to do what's right or good. That is, to have some sort of weakness of will. On this view, the sort of ultimate desires that you have just always win out. And so what you did is always just a function of what you desired more, right? So if you desire two things, you say you desire to do good, but you also desire to do this other thing. If you desire to do this other thing more, then that thing's going to win, and your desire to do good is going to be sort of swamped. So you're ultimately, in this case, it's your will is just sort of determining what you're going to do on the basis of your desires. There's no such thing as having a weak will where you really want to do the good thing, but you just can't. You just sort of lack the ability to do it. Well, on this view, like, what exactly would we how would we think of an addict? Well, an addict in this case would just be someone that ultimately their desire to do the drug just sort of swamps all of their other desires. And so even if they say something like, well, look, I don't want to be an addict anymore, I don't want to act in this way anymore, we shouldn't believe them if this theory is true, because really, in the end, their desires are just what's controlling them. And their desires are always for the drug or whatever it is they're addicted to. That seems to not capture everything we want to think about when it comes to thinking about addiction. We might want to actually accept a theory that allows for the possibility of weakness of will. So, the first kind of move that one might make here to try and complicate a theory of motivation, and basically that means adding to the sort of naive theory to kind of make it more complex and allow for the possibility of certain things that it seems like the naive theory can't allow for. Well, we might add in a level of what we might call the desire strength theory. Now, here again, we have the same preference orderings, right? So in preference orderings, we've got different desires, and certain are more strong than others, and so we, rank them, and we act in certain ways based on the strength of our desires plus the beliefs that we have. So, suppose I have desire 1, desire 2, and desire 3 ranked as such, but I know that I can't actually satisfy desire 1, but I could currently satisfy desire 2 and desire 3. Well, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to clearly try and satisfy desire 2 until I get to a situation in which I do know I could satisfy desire 1, and then desire 1 is going to be the thing that I aim at, right? So this is kind of just how that works. These orderings have higher desires, higher desires have more strength, lower desires have less strength. And sometimes when a new desire kind of comes up, it changes the hierarchy, right? So like, I'll come to all of a sudden, I'm making myself a sandwich, and I open up the refrigerator or the freezer, and I see a bucket of ice cream, and then all of a sudden, oh man, new desire pops in. I'd rather have some ice cream, right? And that swamps the old desire that I was acting on to make a sandwich. Um, on this view, supposing the new desires that kind of pop up sometimes, and it's possible for one desire to be bad and another desire that's in my ordering structure already to be good, it's possible for me to end up doing the bad thing because the new desires that kind of pop up sometimes outweigh. They're stronger, sort of, in they're more vivid, or they're more like immediate, right? Immediate gratification. And even if the action ultimately is bad or morally wrong, then I take that action because it's sort of exciting, or it's just the strength of that desire. It really pops, right? And so it ends up swamping my desire to do the other thing, and so I end up taking the action to bring it about. And this is, one way we could think, instead of, the considered desire theory, where everything is sort of depends on what it is that we recognize as our main desires. Sometimes we get these strong desires that kind of pop up, and they're not considered desires. They're just, they just come out of, I wouldn't say nowhere, but they come sort of unexpectedly, and then they outweigh our desire preference structure. And insofar as they do that, sometimes, you find a wallet on the street that has a bunch of money in it, and you should return it, but you want that money, and the money is right there, and that's exciting in a certain way. It's a desire that's stronger. It's going to outweigh your moral desire, and so you end up acting in a way to keep the money. Now, on this view, yeah, so our desires to do what is good sometimes get swamped by our stronger desires to do what is bad. Ultimately, on this view, we can have a genuine weakness of will, right? Because we know what's best to do, and we have certain desires to do what's best, but we don't act always in that way, because sometimes our desires to do the opposite are stronger. They like pop in, and they become stronger, and even like, so sometimes we act in ways that are contrary to how we really want to act, but it is sort of still a kind of new flashy desire. On this view, people are clearly blameworthy, but they're blameworthy for not being under control of their desires, right? They allowed themselves to sort of get taken hostage by this newfangled, flashy desire. And so we're going to blame them for that, rather than for wanting to do what's bad. We're going to blame them for a certain sort of lack of control. And here the idea would be then applying this to addiction. Addicts can't control their desires for certain addictive substances. The addictive substance, when it comes before them, sort of gives them one of these flashier desires that's much more exciting, or something like that. Much more, it's just stronger than even their desires um, to not take the drug, to get clean, to get sober, to do normal life things. And so then this explains their behavior. And even while they sort of believe that not using is the best action for them, we can sort of explain why they would still use, and maybe think of a little bit, not think of them as poorly, because it's not their sort of, it's not that they really wanted more to do the bad thing. to keep using. It's that, they did have this sort of flashy desire that they didn't have control over, that ultimately caused them to be motivated in one way rather than another. So part of their deep self, their actual preference structure is set up kind of in the right way, but then it gets kind of dominated by these these desires that kind of pop out of nowhere. Well, okay, this view is good, but it's better than the first view, but it also has some problems, right? It doesn't get everything exactly right in certain ways. And I mean, I don't think any view really gets everything exactly right, because we're still doing the science and we're still learning about these things. But there's lots of ways, interesting things to think about here. So one of the problems with this view is that ultimately your preference structure is just more desires. So you have a preference structure where the preference structure is your belief about what is more important than what, but you have to sort of also have what we might call second order desires to actually act on those that preference structure, right? So you have to believe that action one is more important than action two, that desire one is stronger than desire two. But you also have to have sort of a second order desire to follow the preference structure that you've given yourself, where you think taking certain actions is better than taking other actions. You have to have a strong desire to do that. And so ultimately, in this case, when you have new desires pop up, there's not really any weakness of will here. It's still just your desires, kind of one desire swamping another one. And the desire is ultimately just what's going to get you, the stronger desire is just what's going to get you to act in that way. And so we, once again, just can come down and say, look, um, like suppose what's good for you is to stay home and study, but there's a party, and you have this desire to go to the party and this desire to stay home and study, and you also have this second order desire to do what's good for you, but your desire to go to the party is stronger than both your desire to study and your desire to do what's good for you. So it just wins, right? You don't have weakness of will here. It's just the stronger desire wins out, even in the face of these second order desires to do what's good for yourself. So on this view, it kind of, in a way, this view almost like collapses back into the naive view, and so we have a similar problem with both of these views. Um, Similarly, on this view, something that seems particularly problematic when it comes to thinking about addicts or people with addiction, um, is that on this view, addicts seem to end up being especially blameworthy because they can't control the strength of their desires, and so they can't act in good or right ways. Um, it's not entirely clear that that's right, right? Do we really think that addicts are somehow particularly blameworthy for their continued use of drugs, uh, insofar as they're blameworthy for being unable to control how exciting some things actually like look to them, right? Like it's like thinking an addict is somehow someone that's like you know the same as someone that can't control their urges for ice cream or something like that. Like oh, like you're doing this thing wrong because you haven't figured out how to not be like a child in a way, right? Like children have like extreme desires all of a sudden, and this picture kind of paints the addict like the child, insofar as the drug ends up being this thing that like pops into their mind, or they see it or something like that, and then they can't control themselves, but go after it. Um, that seems a little bit weird. Like that doesn't seem to get things exactly right. So maybe we could complicate things a little bit further and get an even better theory. And that's where I am going here, with a kind of more contemporary theory in modern day sort of psychology, and we discussed this in philosophy, of how motivation actually works, from an evolutionary perspective. So we get this thing that is often it's popularized now. I don't know if any of you have ever read. There's this book called Thinking Fast and Slow that I highly recommend, by Kahneman and Tversky. There's some really interesting ways of thinking out there about human decision making. and what's good and what's bad about humans when making decisions, like how we succeed and how we fail. Um, and this way of thinking actually ends up applying like across the board, both for regular decision making, but also for things like addiction and certain kinds of problematic situations. So here's a way of thinking about it. Decision making in humans evolved, right? So there's a certain set of basic needs that all living creatures have, namely, like, okay, for food in humans, that's like sugar and fat we need, right? uh Water, shelter, sex, and just general good feelings, right? We don't want to be constantly filled with anxiety. um Ultimately, given evolution, there was sort of an ancient guidance system that was developed over time that we share with a lot of other animals to help us get these basic needs. This ancient guidance system makes snap decisions, right? Fight or flight decisions, to seek out certain kinds of things, and it takes very little time, effort, or energy to follow these decisions, right? So all of a sudden you feel thirsty, you're seeking out water. All of a sudden you're feeling hungry, you're seeking out food, right? All of a sudden you're horny, right? All of a sudden you're uncomfortable, you're seeking out shelter. Um, that basic form of motivation is sort of shared between us and animals, and all kinds of creatures that have evolved. However, a higher level decision making module has also evolved sort of on top of the basic one, the ancient one, over time, that helps us as humans or higher level creatures that have a little bit more ability to reason do extra things. So it evolved over time. And that means basically, how does evolution work? Well, it was really successful and allowed us to succeed more often than not at procreating and surviving. Um, and this system really did help us. How did it help us? Well, it helped us to make certain kinds of forecasting decisions, right? So like your dog can't think about, what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next year. And so your dog isn't good at doing certain things uh, that will prep it for that, right? So human beings are good at this. We forecast, we can recognize, oh, winter is coming, and so we need to harvest all this food and then store it and save it and make reasonable decisions, right? So, like, some animals do that already, right? They store food for the winter. Do you think that they're actually thinking about that? No, it's just an evolutionary process that's sort of built into them, where they store things and then know where to go back to find them in the winter. But humans, we have this actual higher level cognition that allows us to actually, know that something is going to come and then plan for it, prep for it. This higher level of reason allows us to do like calculations and all kinds of things and think in more complicated ways. However, this newer system of cognition, this newer system of decision making that we have access to, that can, give us motivations, it takes more time, it takes more energy, it takes more effort, and it's the kind of system that ultimately can easily be distracted or disoriented. Um, Both because maybe we haven't worked out all the kinks evolution wise, and also just because it's more complicated. Now, on this view of motivation, there's two different systems of control, right? Sometimes the base system of motivation is in control, and sometimes the higher system is in control, right? So sometimes and ultimately these two can kind of be at odds with one another. They can fight for control. Sometimes the base system takes control when we need to make snap decisions, when we need to fight or flight, or we are, in life or death situations, we need to get food, we need to get water. Sometimes certain kinds of things just win out. So morality isn't always, at issue when it comes to these kinds of situations. And other times, the higher level system is, you know, in control and can actually make decisions for based on what we foresee as good, what we foresee as the best in the best interest for all of us, what we, based on our actual considered desires. Now, the higher system can, of course, get overloaded or distracted, and this can allow the base system to kick back in, right? So the idea here is like when you're tired, when you're hungry, when you've got more than one thing going on, the higher level system gets overloaded. So they've done like lots of studies with this, right? So imagine like just self-control scenario. They ask you, whether or not you want. I think that this is an example of a study or an experiment that they did. You two different people go into a room. One person is given the chance of eating carrots or eating a piece of cake, and sort of that's just it. It's just given the choice, and then the person kind of thinking oftentimes about whether or not they're being healthy will take the carrots over the cake a good amount of the time, because eating a big piece of cake in the middle of the day is kind of not always the best idea. Now, second group of people, they'll send them in and they'll give them a mental calculation to do. They'll give them like a phone number, and they'll ask them to memorize the phone number and remember it. And then so the people will be doing something, and they'll basically be distracting their higher level system, right? They're doing some sort of form of reasoning, and then they're offered the between the cake and the carrots, and oftentimes they'll take the cake because it's sort of the lower level motivation system wants the cake, right? Because it's sugar and fat or something like that. It's like more rewarding for that system, and so but the reason that or the thought behind this is that the lower level system has this sort of snap judgment. The higher level system is distracted in this case, and so ultimately can't kind of kick in to allow the person to think, oh, you know what, I'd rather be eating the carrots because that's more conducive to my long-term goals of being healthy. So ultimately, it's like we can think of it in this way. Desires that can be created by the lower system can sometimes hijack the higher system if we lack a certain amount of self-control, or if the higher system is sort of, if we're in very specific kinds of situations. Now, on this view, there's a few things that are a little bit funny about it, and it sort of just depends on how you want to think about it, I think. One sort of issue that you might think about with this view is that ultimately, according to this view, we are constantly at war within ourselves. There's sort of our higher level self and our lower level self, and these two systems are always fighting with one another. The higher level self kind of whips the lower level self into shape, but the lower level self still kind of, when it can get away with things, gets away with things, right? There's this kind of picture of the chariot model, or like I like to think of it maybe as the dog walking model of the self, right? Where ultimately on the chariot, there's we're one big thing. We are a big, horse and buggy. And there's the higher level self, the person that's guiding the horse, and the lower level self, the horse, right? And the higher level self tries to learn how to guide, but the lower level self ultimately gets to kind of direct us and pull us where it wants. So what the issue here is, should we really be thinking of human motivation in this way? Is this the right way to think of human motivation? It seems like it's getting closer. I don't know if it's spot on yet, but it's an interesting and complicated and well thought out view. How then should we think of or treat addicts on this view? Can we ultimately blame them at all? Ultimately, on this view, addicts really aren't in control. It's a subsystem of them that controls their actions, right? It's just this lower level self. On this view, human beings are made up of all kinds of different subsystems, right? You have a digestion, sort of your metabolism is a subsystem of you. Your cell division is a subsystem of you. But we're not going to, we're not going to blame you for you digesting your food, right? It's not something you have control over, right? You just don't have control over digestion. You similarly don't have control over your skin growth, right? Cell division. These are things that no one controls. I mean, except for other, like, unless you try to like end your life or something like that, right? You'll stop metabolizing if you end your life. But that's not the same idea here, right? Is you don't have the mental ability to start and stop your digestion from happening within yourself. Um, right. But so on this view, then, does an addict's inability to uh, you know, have self control over their lower subsystem when it comes to it giving them these strong desires for to take drugs, like does that work in the same way? Like, can we not blame them at all in the same way that we can't blame you for undergoing digestion? Well, it's not entirely clear, right? So on this view, it does seem like we do have genuine weakness of will, but the weakness is had by this sort of higher level system, right? And it's subject to the strength of the other. So the thought here is maybe, okay, so we do have genuine weakness of will. So that is cool. We can explain that idea now, but it's on the basis of having these two systems. And then it's unclear whether or not we should blame people for acting in certain ways when the lower system is sort of in control, because if we are identifying ourselves with the higher level system that actually does the reasoning and the thinking and the recognizing of what's good, and the actually, like, having a preference structure and desire structure, well, if that whole system can just get swamped by the lower system, like, is it really the case that anyone's ever actually going to be free and then morally responsible on this view? So is this ultimately right? Right. So self-control does really feel like a real thing, right? We definitely do have self-control, more or less, in different situations, and it is something that it seems like we can get better at and lose over time if we don't sort of practice. So maybe we should think of addicts as blameworthy, but as blameworthy for failing to develop better self-control, while recognizing that they don't actually have complete control of their ability to do so, right? They don't have complete control of themselves, but they also don't have complete control of their ability to develop better self control. And this is one of those things where maybe we can think about, you know, how blameworthy an addict is or how problematic of a situation we have on our hands. So, first, a kind of moral aside before continuing on. There's a certain aspect of moral luck to everyone's life. Um, and this relates back to thinking about Aristotle, but it should sort of affect our thinking, I think, more than it does oftentimes. So think about how good you are currently able to try to be, right? When you take actions, there's a certain aspect of you that allows you to sort of morally control your actions and think, oh, this is the right thing to do. And then you're hopefully able to actually follow that through. Sometimes you're not, sometimes you are. So how good are you at being in control in those situations? So do you have control over those kinds of actions ultimately? Like, do you have control over those actions, or does your sort of do you have motivations that you simply do not have control over, that you allow or are unable to stop yourself from acting in certain ways? Well, if you have any of these kinds of motivations, if you ultimately can't control those motivations, how do you in the end really have control over your actions at all? Now, there's something to being moral. There's something to being a good person that involves what we might think of as trying to be moral, right? You have to be able to try to be moral in order to be moral anyway, like oftentimes, because otherwise, if you're not trying to be moral, other motivations will just kind of kick in. But what is it that determines how motivated you can actually be in this endeavor. What determines your ability to try to be moral? Does that make sense? What is it that gives you the sort of motivational power or force to actually try to do what is good? Well, that seems like something that you aren't in control of. That's something that just kind of comes from deep within you. Maybe it's something that was instilled within you by your genes or by your parents and your upbringing. But if you can't ultimately control this, then what can you do to be a better person, to do the right thing? How can you ever try harder when it comes to thinking about what it is to be able to try in the first place? The thought applies, I think, again, also to like moral or to economic motivation, right? So some people think that um, when it comes to your place in life, you need to just try harder in order to work harder, right? You need to try harder. Well, but what about like what gives you the ability to try in the first place? You can't try harder to try harder, right? You just are instilled initially with a certain amount of moral motivation, maybe, or just currently, right? Through your upbringing, through your genetic structure, through the way that you believe about, like what you believe about things. Somehow you are given a certain ability to try. Some people are given more and other people are given less. But the fact that that is sort of random and a feature of luck gives us a certain kind of picture of how in control we ultimately are when it comes to thinking about these things. So if we ultimately aren't in control of how much of an ability we have to try to do what's right or anything really, how can we actually think that we are free? How can we think that we have something like free will? And if we don't actually have something like free will in any kind of robust sense, if we aren't able to be free to do as we, ultimately wish that we could do because we don't have sort of necessarily instilled within us all the ability to try, can we ever be at fault? Can we ever be blamed for our actions? Can we ever really be deserving of punishment or sanction for acting in certain ways when we weren't in control? I mean, when someone is forced to do something, say someone kidnaps your child and then forces you to rob a bank, threatening that they'll kill your child, you don't blame the individual for robbing the bank. They were forced to. They were being forced to. They're doing something that we would generally think of as immoral, but not in this case because, they aren't blameworthy in this case because they weren't able, their actions weren't free. Isn't that the same thing here? If all of our actions are ultimately just the result of forces beyond our control, our upbringing and our genetic structure, how is it that we can really be blameworthy for any of these actions to begin with? So the question ends up coming up, do you really have to be free in order to be ever held morally responsible? And if everything ultimately sort of before is determined, is it ever really possible for us to be free? This gets us to the Churchland article that I assigned, and we'll take a slight detour, I think, through a cluster of ideas. The topic of free will is very complex and very deep. It's a metaphysical topic that's as problematic or difficult or highfalutin as wondering whether or not a fetus is a person, like when persons come into existence. It matters a lot in philosophy, but it's very difficult to sort of distill out what's most important. So this is just one take on the topic of free will, and it's a take that takes seriously neuroscience. Patricia Churchland, called a neurophilosopher, takes the point of view that in order to ultimately understand the mind, motivation, and morality, we need to understand the brain. On Churchland's view, it turns out that, science hasn't found anything like a material soul that's somehow connected to the brain or that has any special claim to being what we are. Instead, she thinks, look, our brains seem to be the most important centers of human action, decision making, and moral reasoning. The brain, as far as we can tell, is the core to our being. Now, it seems that free will can't be this thing then that kind of where actions just come, like spring forth from us in an undetermined way that's like based on like a causal vacuum from the soul, right? It's like human beings are certain ways, and then that creates the actions that come from us. It's not as if we have this soul that makes a decision and then that somehow affects our body to then take the action. No, she doesn't think that that works as a view. She thinks instead that we make decisions and act, and these things kind of come from our brain, and our brains are set up in certain ways, and our brain chemistry and brain activity is based on how our genes work, how evolution determined our genes to work, and how our upbringings were. And free will, ultimately, if it's anything, if there really is anything that we want to call free will, is really going to be closely related, if not exactly the same thing, as having self control. So, on Churchland's view, if you thought that free will was this thing that you had to have a soul in order to have, and you had to, like, somehow be an uncaused cause, right? Like every decision that you made was like not caused by any physical stuff kind of impinging on you. It was just, your soul made a decision, and then that somehow got zapped into your brain, and then your brain creates these actions. If that's what free will is, Churchland thinks, no, there really isn't free will like that. But she does think, look, if there is free will, what it really is, and it does seem like there's free will, like we seem to be able to act in ways that we want to act somewhat relatively freely. If there really is free will in any serious way, what is free will? Well, for her, she thinks it's the ability that we have to control ourselves. It's our ability to become self-controlling beings and develop self-control. What about moral responsibility? So, on Churchland's view, we have a kind of natural response oftentimes to punish members of our group, particularly those members that act in ways that undermine the group in some way, right? So, remember, murderers, rapists, thieves, etc. They are part of our group, but somehow do something that undermines the stability of the group itself. Now, we often think when someone does something that undermines the group itself, that person is in some way in control of their actions. And insofar as they're in control of their actions, we think that they're blameworthy, right? And we need to punish them for what they're doing. But do they really have control, right? So some philosophers think, look, no, the brain is really just this kind of causal machine. It's an organic causal machine, but it's a causal machine in the same way that the body is, and that a car is. So ultimately, can we really hold someone responsible then for acting in a certain way or for being in control when they really aren't? Well, Churchland thinks, no, look, self-control is really important here. We can develop it from youth onward, and animals develop self-control, and so can we. Ours is just a little bit more complex, right? And she gives examples, right? Like thinking about like foxes, or just take any baby creature and its ability to stand still or its ability to hunt. Well, it doesn't have the ability to hunt until it develops over time, right? It has to create more, have more and more situations in which it learns to slowly control itself, to act in ways that we might think of as pro-social or avoid antisocial actions. So self-control, she thinks, especially in humans, involve taking pro-social actions and avoiding antisocial actions, where pro-social actions are acting in ways that seem like altruistic or helping others, and avoiding antisocial actions are avoiding actions that ultimately are detrimental to the group or the society that we are a part of. And so she thinks that from this point of view, we can kind of come to recognize how self-control could possibly be something that evolved into us, and how free will and moral responsibility can be related to certain kinds of self-control, right? Um, we need to be self-controlling beings in order to successfully live in our groups. Now, once someone becomes an addict, and this is sort of become recognized, the parts of their brain that are related to self-control become affected. Certain things become, in a way, broken. Certain reward centers and systems don't work in the way that they normally work. And so, given given the sort of brain situation of addicts, this often causes them to respond poorly in situations that involve self-control, like delayed gratification. Um, and this happens, I think, a lot, right? So, like, think about a child. At a certain age, they don't have the ability to delay gratification, right? You leave one cookie in front of them and say, "Wait. If you wait 5 minutes, you get two cookies." You know, at a certain point, like early on, they'll just eat the cookie, right? They're not going to wait for the second one. But then they're able to sort of develop over time, over learning, that delaying gratification is actually worth it. Well, imagine though that their brains were unable to develop, or that something had happened to their brains to where it sort of locked in this inability to delay gratification. Well, that's ultimately how people with addictions brains end up getting locked in. So on this view, I mean, if we think that free will is sort of closely related to self-control, then it seems that addicts ultimately really have lost some of their ability to act freely, insofar as self-control, the self-control centers of the brain really are damaged or changed in some way. So that's the kind of thought here is, if addicts are, if being addicted is related to a person's self-control, and the self-control centers in their brain are affected in certain ways, then it doesn't seem like the addict ultimately is going to have the free will to act in ways that we think of as necessary to either stop being addicted, or to really ultimately be held fully morally responsible. So, if this is correct, it seems that it implies, at least, that we should hold addicts less responsible for their actions once they're addicted. That is, we can, of course, hold them responsible for the actions that they took up to becoming an addict. But once they are addicted, they have much less control than a non-addicted person. And this, so actions that they take while addicted, in, focusing towards their addiction, especially, like, if an addict um, steals or commits a certain level of violence, um, in order to achieve, what they need in order to satiate their addiction. This similarly is one of those kinds of situations where it seems like ultimately we need to hold them less responsible because they do not have as much self-control. That doesn't ultimately mean, though, that we shouldn't, like, sanction them. We shouldn't necessarily punish them, but sanctions are different than punishment, right? So antisocial actions need to be met with a response always, right? And addicts act in ways that end up bringing about antisocial situations. Anything that undermines society is ultimately unacceptable for society, right? It threatens the very either existence or structure of the society. So the issue, though, is that we shouldn't be thinking, probably, of addicts along these lines as immoral individuals worthy of moral censure, as much as we should be thinking of them like they aren't in need of punishment as much as they're in need of rectification and rehabilitation. Um, and even if that ends up meaning that they need to be separated from society at a certain point, that should be done, but it shouldn't be thought of as a form of punishment in the way that prison often is. It would be better to put, for people like this, at least initially, to be in some kind of situation where they are separate, but being monitored or being able to be helped to hopefully change back their brain chemistry if possible. But it's the sort of attempt to, like thinking of them as fully morally responsible has led, I think, a number of people to thinking about them, about addicts, as morally problematic individuals. However, now it seems that we're able to recognize that they aren't in as much control as a normal individual is. And because they aren't in as much control, they aren't under as much control as a normal individual is, it seems that a certain amount of paternalism is actually going to be justified here. But you might think on the other side, well, wait a minute, isn't paternalism then just going to always be justified, given that no one ever really has free will, right? So if it turns out that our minds are just products of our brains, and our brains are just products of our genes and our upbringing, and all of that is just a product of the distant past, right? The Big Bang kind of set everything up, and everything is determined. How do any of us ever really have any responsibility for anything? And so then, if no one ever really has responsibility for anything, shouldn't we just be able to justify all forms of paternalism, where ultimately, if someone's going to act in a certain way that's harmful to them, we should just do what's in their best interest for them without their decision making, because ultimately they aren't free to make decisions anyway. If all of our actions really are just products of our brains, we don't really have any control at all, right? So should we ever be held responsible for our actions? Here, I think Churchland has an interesting response. She says, well, wait a minute, no, humans have big cerebral cortexes. You might think ants and termites, well, they have small cortexes. And insofar as they have, small abilities to think and decide, they have very little individual control. But humans and other animals that are higher, we have lots more space between genes and decisions. We have more flexibility in our decision making process. And ultimately, she thinks when it comes to free will, really, that's as good as it gets. So, on her view, magical free will doesn't exist, but brain flexibility that relates to self control and decision making does exist. And that's as good as free will ultimately gets. And so, if that's what we have, that's what we have. On that picture, then, we do have a certain sense of moral responsibility, and of those of us that have more self control, and those of us that have less self control have less moral responsibility. I don't know if I actually buy Churchland's view here on free will, but I think for the most part, her view on moral responsibility is correct. I think being held responsible for one's actions is more a matter of self-control than of free will in this sort of more abstract and magic involving kind of way, right? Um, and I think that so we need to develop self-control in order to act in ways that are moral, that is, and act in ways that are the best for ourselves and those around us, and take into consideration lots of different things. And addiction ultimately involves a failure of self-control, sort of most centrally. People that are addicts are less culpable once addicted, but that doesn't mean that they're blameless, nor that we should let them do whatever they're going to do, right? We need to sanction them in some kinds of ways. We need to help them in some kinds of ways. We need to act in ways that are better for them, act in somewhat paternalistic ways. Now, but this also gives us a sort of more general impetus towards society as a whole, I think, if we learn from focusing on addiction, how important self-control is to this notion of free will, and how important self-control is to this notion of moral responsibility, then what we really need to do to sort of help generate a better society at large is educate people and give people the tools to become better at self-control, and to help them in situations in which they lack self-control, and not blame them, or punish them in situations where they lack self-control to begin with. And this is, I think, going to involve lots of cases. So there's lots of different studies nowadays that are coming to recognize all of the different kinds of things that are able to stunt people's abilities at self-control, right? So certain kinds of abuse can stunt the ability for the abused to control rage, to control anger, to control their own, later in life abuse that they might perpetrate. Um, and for these kinds of reasons, I think we should think more deeply and focus more sort of resources towards linking self-control and moral activity, and sort of be more open and forgiving towards people that seem to lack the very ability to develop certain sorts of self-control. That's the end of this lecture. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you in class.